Hey, everybody. This is the Drive On Podcast, where we talk about issues affecting veterans after they get out of the military. I'm your host, Scott DeLuzio, and now let's get on with the show. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Drive On Podcast. Today, my guest is Brooke Seam. Brooke is unlike a lot of our guests on the show in that she isn't a veteran. I met Brooke a couple of weeks ago at a conference where she shared her mental health journey, and I feel like her story might resonate with some of the people who listen to this podcast, so I wanted to have her on the show to share that journey. Now, before we begin, I want to make it crystal clear to everyone who's listening that neither Brooke or I are medical professionals. We're not psychologists or counselors or therapists or anything like that. The story that you're going to hear is unique to Brooke and her situation. The things that we discuss in this episode are not intended to be medical advice or anything like that. And this episode may have information that's beneficial for you and that you can take away and speak with your doctor about if it applies to you in your situation. Ultimately, any medical decisions that you make should be under the direct supervision of your doctor and not because some podcast made it sound like a great idea. Okay, so I think the lawyers will be sufficiently satisfied with that disclaimer. Brooke, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
You know, it's a fantastic disclaimer, and I think that you should just record that for me, and then I will just broadcast it before anything I do ever, because it saves me a lot of headache from having to interject it later on. So my name is Brooke Seam, and if you find me on Instagram or on the internet, I come up and I am a professional chef. I owned a bakery in Manhattan. Then I was on an episode of Chopped. And meanwhile, that's not at all what my life looks like today, or it's not really what I care about deeply. I'm writing a book right now specifically about getting off of antidepressants. And so I've kind of spent the past 2 years pretty much in like a deep creative writer's hole, just kind of trying to untangle my past and figure out why, when I was 15 when I was put on these drugs, what happened that led to a point when I was 30 and I was, ready to just be done with this world. And yet I was being treated for depression. And so I've spent the past 3 years, 3 years thinking about this topic, the past 2 years writing about this incredibly uplifting topic. And I'm happy to be here and just brighten everybody's day.
Exactly. Yeah. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is because through talking to other veterans, I found that the VA, which is where a lot of the veterans go for their health issues, sometimes they will just throw pills at a problem to see if it'll go away. I know for me, this isn't necessarily a mental health issue, but I've shared my own story on this podcast before, where I went into the VA with breathing troubles. After running some tests, I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication. And I knew I wasn't suffering from anxiety other than from the fact that I couldn't really breathe easily. So I basically refused to take the medicine that I was being prescribed. And after doing some research into the symptoms that I was having, I basically turned out that I found out that the certain stomach conditions like heartburn or indigestion or things like that could give you shortness of breath and experience the same kind of symptoms that I was having. So it totally wasn't anxiety. And it turns out that I needed an antacid and not anti-anxiety medication. On another occasion, I had knee pain from an injury when I was in the military, and the VA doctor told me to just stay off it for a few weeks and take Advil if the pain got bad. Unfortunately, I had private insurance at the time, so I went to a civilian doctor for a second opinion, who determined that I needed to have surgery to correct the problem. Now, Brooke, this is not about me. This is you have a story that you started to kind of get a little bit into that probably mirrors some of these issues where you were prescribed the antidepressants and you're prescribed medication at a young age, and then you stayed on them for quite some time. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that with us and kind of that whole journey that you went through?
Yeah, so my father suddenly passed away when I was 15, and it was 2002, and grew up in Reno, Nevada. It was not a time when we had much beyond dial-up internet, and there wasn't necessarily the opportunity to go on Instagram or Google and find the latest like woo-woo thing. So basically what happened is my father suddenly dies, and I naturally, grieve, perhaps not in a way that was particularly convenient or obvious to the adults around me, because, it wasn't like I was crying and openly talking about how sad I was. I more or less just shut down. And that continued on for a period of time that was long enough to be very concerning, for, all the adults around me. And so, 6 months or so go by, whatever it is. And I was taken to a child psychologist who eventually told me that there was, nothing she could do, and that I had an anxiety and depressive disorder, and that I should be medicated. Actually, she didn't tell me that. She called my mom and told my mom, after not communicating anything to my mother during the time. Like, it's a bit interesting how some of this stuff works. And I've tried to go back in time, to the early 2000s in Nevada law, trying to figure out why my mother was told that I needed to go on drugs, but that she was not informed of any of the happenings within our sessions. Because like HIPAA is a thing, client-patient confidentiality. I was also a minor, and honestly, I can't find anything that really tells me what the actual law was at the time. So suffice to say, it just happened. And my mother, still grieving herself, I was an only child, and she didn't really have any other options. Like, what else was she supposed to do? So she took me to a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist's job is to prescribe drugs. And so they put me on a cocktail of antidepressants. And then, it took a while for us to find the right ones that didn't like create such terrible side effects right away that like I couldn't be on them. But eventually we found a few that worked. And then, a series of other problems started coming up. Like, I started to have a lot of like symptoms of thyroid issues. And so they took me to an endocrinologist, and my thyroid was low. And then I had this mysterious stomach illness for years where I would just be walking on the side of the road and I would just like throw up, like just like walking, puke. And so that was concerning. So like we went through a series of tests to figure out what that was for, and like more medication got piled on. And so by the time I was like about 18 and ready to go to college, I think I was taking 6 or 7 pills a day. And it wasn't that, we didn't have reason for any of these things, I suppose, but nobody ever really sat back to like look at the greater landscape of what was going on in my life and asking like, okay, well, maybe the deep sadness and the depression is a result of grief. Now, my father, he was actually a vet. He was in Vietnam, and he had some pretty severe, what we would call mental health issues that, I don't really know where they came from, but there was like a clear argument for, some sort of quote unquote genetic link. So I think that's a big reason why we kind of didn't really just like pass it off as grief, because I was, of a person who had his own struggles. But the same thing with my stomach and all these things, like, maybe the fact that I had really terrible stomach issues was because I had gone through a loss and I was applying to college and my whole world was being pulled out under me. And no one ever really asked that. And neither did I. I mean, again, it was the early 2000s and I was under 18 and I was trying to get a really good SAT score. And like, you just kind of do what people tell you to do at some point when you're a kid. And so then, I go to college and ultimately I moved to New York, and there was just never a reason to question any of the medications I was on. And a big reason for that was because I went on the medication like kind of right at the start of puberty. I was, a little bit of a late bloomer. So I effectively like came of age and my mind and body developed while I was drugged. So by the time I get, into the real world and I'm an adult, like I have no frame of reference for how I should be, because the only frame of reference I had, I was a kid and it was before my father died. So I just sort of assumed I had developed into the appropriate person and that everything was fine. and I don't know, I just operated under that mentality. And then I just, I had similar experiences with doctors where, like, if you can even get past the insurance system, which kind of limits your choices for medical professionals in this country, like, I had a series of terrible experiences with psychiatrists in New York. And ultimately, I just went to my GP and he shrugged his shoulders and basically said whatever and gave me whatever I wanted. Like, I didn't abuse the system, but he never questioned the fact that I came to him and was like, I'm on these 6 things. And so I just kept taking them again because, like, I was still 100% depressed while I was on these drugs. And so I kind of just made what I think is a natural assumption that if I am this depressed on them, how the hell could I operate without them? Like, it never occurred to me that maybe either the drugs were wrong for me or that I was experiencing something called discontinuation syndrome, or that, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that the efficacy of these drugs decreases over time. So for all I knew, like, I was kind of just taking a sugar pill, but also not really, because when I did get off them, the withdrawal experience was, like, so beyond hellish that there was clearly something going on in my body. But, like, again, I'm not the doctor here. So I'm just kind of chugging along. And, it wasn't until I was 30 that I was starting to have some pretty scary suicidal thoughts and tendencies. And I was kind of at a point where I was just like, I cannot do this anymore. And I didn't even really know what this was. It was just like, whatever it meant to be alive, I didn't feel like I could do it. And so, I'm a little bit quirky. So I was, kind of like going about my own little quirky self-management ways of life, which included calculating the day of my own death and, doing some math and, those things that you do on Tuesday night. But I had done, we can get into that in a second. But, ultimately, I kind of wandered over to my window, and I lived on the 30th floor, and I had, like, very consciously avoided that 30th floor window for years because the urge to just, like, fall out of it was too strong. And then one day I went over and I, like, opened the window and I kind of pried open the screen that was kind of lodged in there, and I, like, stuck my body out as far as it could go, and I started doing, like, physics and a little math, trying to figure out, like, how long it would take to hit the ground. And that's kind of when I just, like, all the gears in my head suddenly came to this screeching halt. And I had this realization that, like, one, like, this is not how someone who's being treated for depression should be acting. And two,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And two, that I never really made the choice to go on the drugs or to stay on them. And so I just kind of had this fleeting, curious thought that was like, who am I if I'm not medicated? Like, what is underneath all this? And so I decided to get off the drugs, and, 3.5 years later, I can say, like, best decision of my life, but let's just say it was not a graceful 18 months.
Sure. Yeah. And coming off of anything that you've been on for that long, I got to imagine is just not going to be fun really for anybody.
No.
But so I kind of want to circle back to something that you were talking about, how you kind of calculated how much time you had left. And in terms of, when you might, pass away based on all of these different, tests that you might find online, from insurance websites and things like that. And now, I know this because you talked about this at the conference that we were at. And so I have a little bit of insight into how you came about this calculation, but the how isn't so much, what I'm interested in. So some people might listen to what you said there in terms of how you calculated the how many days you had left and all this type of stuff, and think that you're sort of looking forward to that date in the same way that a kid might count down the days to Christmas or whatever. But I don't think that that's really what you're saying necessarily with that date. And maybe it was when you first counted down, but in a way, in a strange way, if you know how much time you have left, to me anyways, this would be my kind of mindset, anyways. If you know how much time you have left, it sort of acts as a reminder to not put things off, that you could do today, or, more, in the more immediate, future, basically to live life to the fullest, because that way, you're thinking to yourself, there's a fixed number of days ahead of you. And I mean, we all have a limited supply of days left, but, we don't typically think of how many days we have left. Some of us live like as if we have an endless supply of days that are left. So to us, it doesn't really matter if we didn't get to travel to that place that we always wanted to go to, or tell that person the thing that we've always wanted to say, because we can always do it later. But knowing that there's a fixed number of days ahead sort of forces you to be more on top of those things, and act more intentionally, with those types of things. Is that kind of the experience that you found with yourself when you, ultimately came to that number, or that date, and put it on the calendar? Is that kind of what you felt?
I would say maybe at points that's how I felt. In the beginning, it really started as an exercise, simply more because of the morbid curiosity, and I really was so I was so dark at that point that I just wanted to know that it was going to end, because I kind of had like this sort of nebulous thought that like ultimately I was in charge of my own fate, and if I wanted to take my life, I could. But I also kind of wanted to know that like if I didn't take such an extreme final step, that the pain would still be over. Like there was a deep need for me to know that this was temporary. And so I went through, and I literally just took probably taken about a dozen life expectancy tests from, life insurance websites and BuzzFeed, and I just averaged the results and put them all together. And I was given this date of November 6, 2069, which is a Wednesday. And it's like the concept of having, a handful of days left, or, in my case at that point, it was well over 19,000 days left. That's kind of a number that is a little bit nebulous, and it's hard to actually conceptualize. And it's big enough that, you don't really notice when little pieces of it are counting down. So what I decided to do was actually, schedule it in my calendar, because I felt like if I wrote something down and I, made it like I honored it as a thing I had to do, then it would hold a little bit more weight and it would feel a little bit more real. So Google Calendars actually lets you project out like into as far as you want. And so I was able to schedule the day of my death I think it's at like 12 p.m. on a Wednesday. It only takes an hour. So the good news is that, I'm only dead for an hour and then I'm back. But it sits there, and now it's there, and it's there forever. And, what kind of started to happen was that knowing that I had this, date in the future that was certainly coming, it helped take the edge off of everything, because what I had been struggling to find was relief for so long. And I really needed to know that the pain I was feeling was temporary. And so whether or not it was, I knew that I was in charge of my own life. Like if I wanted to take my life, I could, but that didn't quite feel like the answer. That felt too like I was just far more in charge than I should be. And what I wanted was just to know that in a natural life, in my life, that there would be relief. And so in scheduling this date, like suddenly I had a guaranteed day of relief. I had a guaranteed day when all of this would go away. And so what happened is that temporary nature started to kind of, affect various aspects of my life. And, I think I thought that maybe it would make me feel a little bit more like spontaneous, or that I would, blow a bunch of money on an epic trip or something, but nothing like that really happened. I still went about living my life the exact same way, but the shift happened in these little moments. So I noticed that if things were really bad or things were good, I had a sense of them and an understanding that that situation was temporary, and that had a dual purpose, because it both really helped make all the negative things a lot easier to handle, because if I was, in a bad situation with my business, or if I was, on a slow subway train, whatever it was, like I knew logically that this would end. It would have to end, not only because the situation like inevitably was going to end one day, but that also like my life as a whole would end. And oddly, that thought felt really comforting, just to know that it was all going to end. On the other hand, the temporary nature of things also started to affect all the positive things in my life. So if I had 5 minutes to sit on my couch and pet my dog before I had to be somewhere, suddenly those 5 minutes felt a lot more precious than they did before. And so I kind of just was able to put a little barrier between, my reaction and the situation, because I knew that it was temporary. And that's kind of what started to, I think, affect my life in a more positive way, was just that, my reactions weren't as extreme. And I started to focus a little bit more on the positive things, which is, an extraordinarily difficult thing to do when you are deeply depressed. But it was a little teeny tiny trick, 1% better.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at with when we were talking about how much time you have left and how it acts as that kind of reminder not to put things off. But I think the way you're putting it actually makes a lot of sense too, because those little moments, things that you may not even think of normally, petting your dog, for example, you're sitting there scratching them, petting them or whatever, and like it's just a thing you're doing. It's almost like a reflex, and you
Exactly.
don't put much thought into it. But when you look at it as like, I should value this and treasure this moment, you do it with a little bit more intention, and you kind of pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing, as opposed to scrolling, Instagram or whatever while you're also petting the dog. You might be a little more focused, or whatever it is, if it's playing with your kids, or talking to a friend or something, whatever, you're a little bit more focused and intentional with that. So I like how that that kind of initially morbid thought turned into a positive for you, and kind of helped you see the little moments in life and appreciate those a little bit more. Like that was pretty interesting. So you also were talking about how you didn't really, go off and do any kind of, crazy, blow a lot of money on travel or, things like that. But you did take a rather significant trip. Yes. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So when I first did these calculations, it was 2014. So I still had another 2 years about being medicated. And then what had happened is, kind of when I was about to turn 30, it was 2016. I was, definitely trending more towards the dark than the light all the time. And I needed to get out. That's when I was, doing physics calculations from my window, and had this realization that I, had no idea who I was without these drugs. And, I kind of sat on that thought for a little bit. And then right around the same time, though, what happened is I got an opportunity to travel with a program called Remote Year. And Remote Year is an organization that's effectively a glorified travel agent for working professionals. So the idea is that you and 70 strangers all pay one company to deal with your travel and your accommodations all around the world for a year. So when I, found out about this program, and I drunkenly applied one night. I got in a big fight with my business partner, and I was really mad. And so I just applied for a program that was completely not at all something that my life was set up to handle. But, sometimes you fantasize, and when you're drunk, and that's what I did. And the shocking part was that I started making it through all these interview processes, and I wouldn't say I was lying, but I was definitely fudging the truth about my capabilities of leaving. And I keep making it through all the interviews, and then the next thing the next thing I know, they offer me a spot. And so, I've on the one hand, I have this realization that, I've been medicated and drugged my entire life. On the other hand, I have this opportunity to blow a bunch of money and do something I may never get the opportunity to do again. And it was the combination of the two that was the catalyst for me actually getting off all of the drugs I was on, because I realized that, like, all right, my life desperately needed to change. And I knew that if I took this opportunity to travel, even though I had no plan of how it was actually going to work out, I knew my life would never be the same after. And at the time, all I was looking for was something different. I didn't have any particular inclination or care like what it looked like. I just needed to be different. But at the same time, like, we were traveling to like a remote island in Thailand and Cambodia and all these places where I was not really sure that I would be able to get the drugs I was on in the countries I was in. And so I made the choice. I had about 4 or 5 months from the time I got accepted into the program to the time when I was supposed to get on the plane. And I said, all right, I'm going to take this time and I'm going to at least try to get off all these drugs so I can get on the plane and not have to carry a suitcase full of prescription medication with me. And so that's how everything started. And so, I started detoxing off of all of these drugs, which was just like one level of hell after another. Like everything from your typical shakes and sweats to having very intense, like, almost visions. It wasn't hallucinations in the sense of like seeing things that weren't there, but it was like constant intrusive images passing through my mind at like an incredibly fast, bloody, and violent rate. Just while I'm walking down the streets of New York. And, there were...
That's exactly what you want to say.
Yeah,
too.
right. I mean, like, New Yorkers are kind of angry as a concept, but this was a level to which I had never experienced. I had like my physical body completely changed. My eyesight changed. It actually got better. My hearing intensified like crazy. My skin got super sensitive. So I started having all these really weird skin reactions. I couldn't wear clothes I used to wear because the fibers irritated my skin. The way I tasted food totally changed. That I had episodes of rage so severe that at one point I bent a metal ironing board in half. I weigh about 120 pounds. It was just right, like some Hulk level of rage, but like it was what I think was happening. And there's really not a lot of research on the science of withdrawal. We have some studies that have been analyzed lately, like going over old studies that have been done that are, they're pointing to the fact that people are having a really hard time getting off these drugs. As far as I know, there has not been any study about like the actual physical or the actual physiology of what's going on in your body when you're trying to get off these drugs. But my hunch is just that, I went from a brain that was like literally operating on autopilot with these meds to one that had no idea how to react to anything because I hadn't been clear-headed for 15 years. And I think like every system just kind of like exploded all at once. And that lasted for a long time. It lasted for a solid 9 months to a year after I had stopped taking all the drugs. And so it wasn't just a matter of like getting the drugs out of my system. It was a matter of completely inhabiting a new body that had to learn how to operate in the world. Like the best way I can describe it is that it felt like going through puberty twice. With weird hormones and all sorts of things going on.
Well, and yeah, because there's definitely a lot of changes that are taking place when you're going from living every single day on these drugs and having the, I don't want to say crutch necessarily, but maybe the benefit of whatever it is that they're providing for you. But then the next day, all of a sudden, you're no longer having that there, and so it's I can almost see how it's like,
Yeah.
learning how to walk all over again,
Yeah.
it's like a whole new experience.
It is. And I will say though that, like I said, I mean, I struggle so much sometimes with this topic, especially when I talk to other people, because like it's clear to me that I've just had piss poor luck with psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. Like I know that there are a lot of really good doctors out there who care about their patients and would not tolerate some of the things that I was told or put through. And I don't necessarily think that I didn't have someone sitting across from me in an office who was just like purposefully evil. But I also know that they weren't really listening to me and they weren't taking in the broader spectrum of my life. So, the drugs that I was on in particular, are notoriously hard to get off of. As far as my understanding goes, there are some antidepressants that aren't as difficult to get off of as the ones that I was on. But still, like there was only so much I could taper down before I was, with a, kind of stuck with like the minimum viable dose for some of these pills. And, there were things my doctor could have told me that I know now in hindsight in order to help manage these symptoms. And she didn't. And so like, I know that there are a lot of really hellish withdrawal effects for people who are taking high doses of these medications and then stop cold turkey. That definitely happens. There's a reason why tapering exists and why it should be long and deliberate. But there's still a point at which you do have to extract yourself entirely from those medications. And it's not as easy as when you first start taking them. And that's the big question and the big concern that I have with the way we prescribe all these drugs for people is because we feel our pain so much and we want immediate relief, but we don't have the forethought about what our life looks like and how we build a future for ourselves that is not fully reliant on these medications, because these medications are not designed for long-term use. They're designed for short-term use, and we just kind of have stopped treating them like that. And, we're entering a time now where people are now on the drugs for 10, 15, 20 years. I was part of a very early generation. Like I was part of the first generation of adolescents to be medicated. But my story is getting more and more common. And the science is not there to back up what's happening. And the anecdotes are not there to back up what's happening. And people are just starting to kind of, from my perspective, they're starting to wonder what's going on and what their other options are, while also feeling fully chemically dependent on these drugs.
Yeah, and like what you were saying before, I think it's society in general wants that instant gratification. It's the Amazon or the Netflix, type of situation where I want to go buy something today on Amazon and I want it on my front porch tomorrow morning. I want to watch a movie, so I'm going to go on Amazon or on Netflix and I'm going to watch it right now because I want to watch it. There's no more driving to Blockbuster and getting a movie or waiting for it to come out in the, whatever. You turn on the television and you start watching, and because you want it now. And unfortunately, a lot of people take that same attitude with their health, whether it's mental health or physical health or whatever. They want a solution for it right now. And a lot of these things don't have a right now solution that's really appropriate. And even, in situations like you experienced when you were grieving, the loss of your father, maybe it was appropriate to have some sort of medication to kind of help you get through that situation while you were also working through it in some other way so that you didn't have to be on it for over a decade and, just continue living your life thinking that, oh, this is just what I need to function. There was that one event, and lots of people are depressed after the loss of a loved one. That's totally normal. Speaking from personal experience, there's definitely a grieving process that you have to go through. And if you're just told that there's something wrong with you, in addition to grieving, that's probably not the best solution for you.
Right.
Now, during all this time, especially when you were coming off of the medication, Did you have any kind of support network in terms of family or friends or things like that, or people who are around to kind of say, hey, you're seems like there's something not quite right. Is everything okay, or kind of to help you with all of this, through all of this?
Yeah, so I want to circle back to the grief comment in a second. I'll
Oh
answer
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
answer this question first. So I've been very lucky to have supportive people around me, but as anybody who's been deeply depressed and or experienced a deep trauma, um, you know, sometimes it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, it's still you and it's still your pain. And, I knew I was never going to be on the street. And, I had a roof on my head and I had someone I could call, and all of that was so hugely valuable. But at the end of the day, it was still ultimately kind of up to me to, really decide to take the steps to heal all of this. I did a fairly unconventional form of counseling that I credit with helping me through all of this. And it kind of ties into the whole grief thing. So, if you look at the symptoms of grief and the symptom of depression, they're nearly identical. And so, it doesn't surprise me at all that we kind of confuse one for the other, especially when, there's very much a hierarchy of grief in our society. Like, a mother who's lost a
Mhm.
child is quote unquote allowed to grieve for a very long time, whereas a child who's lost a stuffed animal is supposed to get over it. Now, in each of their individual worlds, that's the biggest loss they've ever had, right? And you know, I think that so much of our society is constant grief, and we are constantly grieving all of the things we've lost. And, for me, like the biggest pieces of grief I've had, like, aside from losing my father, have been like, I was a very serious ballet dancer and I broke both my feet when I was 18. And that was the end of the longest, like, it was effectively the longest relationship of my life. It was the thing I cared about the most, and it was suddenly gone, right? And the amount of grief
Mhm.
I felt from that, I didn't know that I was grieving, but I was. And so, you kind of throw that on top of everything else. And when you think about careers you lose, or, fights with friends that ultimately end up parting ways, or leaving a house you loved or a place you lived in, like, the amount of change we experience in our life, and I imagine that this happens so much, like with the vets, it's that you have lived in this one world and you're suddenly pulled out of it. There is a grieving process that is happening there that I think, for pretty much all humans all the time, is being confused with a lot of really deep depression.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, 100%. A lot of the vets that I've talked to, none of them really phrased it as grief, necessarily, but just the transition from military life to back to civilian life after they get out of the military, it's almost like they don't know
Mm-hmm.
what to do with themselves. Like in the military, their day was planned. At this time you wake up, at this time you eat breakfast, at this time you do this, at this time you do that, and your day was planned. Everything that you do is planned, where you need to be, and all that kind of stuff. And then you become a civilian, and it's just like,
Yeah.
do
Right.
whatever. Come if you want, go
Yeah.
if you want, whatever, and it's all cool. And it's like, how in the hell am I supposed to
Right.
live like this? Like it's just too much.
It's asking you effectively to be a different person. And that, therefore, if you're being a different
Exactly.
person, then that implies that a part of you has been lost. There's a saying sometimes that gets thrown around in ballet called "a dancer dies twice," because it's all about the loss of that career that usually happens at a very young age, as opposed to a lot of other professions. And it strikes me as particularly relevant here. But what
Yeah,
happened though is
absolutely.
that, like, because I didn't have the greatest luck in, traditional talk therapy or with the traditional mental health world. And again, like, I got shit luck. A lot of people don't. I know plenty of people who, like, love their
Mhm.
therapists to death, but I had to go out and find other ways to kind of help myself. And part of one of the things that I struggled with always was, like, I'm a pretty private person and I really like my home. And it always felt so strange to me to physically go into an office and like sit there in front of someone for 45 minutes under like a clear hierarchy of relationship. Like I was paying someone to listen to me, and it was their job to inform me of things that were supposed to help, but only for 45 minutes. And then we were done. And then I had to like go back into the world and go into my life and like wait a month. I don't know. It just like, it never really quite worked in my head. And so what had happened is that my mom was listening to a radio show, and there was a man named Edward Mannix who came up on this show, and he's a self-described spiritual counselor. And she was listening to him, and she said, you know, I think you need to contact this guy. And I waited a while. I waited until I was so desperate that I was ready to try anything, because I was, you know, rather hesitant at his claims. And, you know, I didn't believe that like karma and gratitude journals were going to cure me and all that crap. So I just like couldn't really get there. And then I got to a point where I was just like, you know, I'm willing to try anything. And so I ended up making an appointment with Edward, and we ended up working together, and all of it was done remotely. So he has a particular technique that is rooted in the idea of self-compassion. And so, you know, this is a fairly common mindset if, you know, you're into certain kinds of meditation, or even, you know, certain kinds of like talk therapy. You know, they talk about the inner child or the inner twin or all sorts of things. But the idea for me that really resonated so much with me is that like there were all these little pieces of me all over. Like from my entire life, there were kind of snapshots of myself and who I was, and things that had happened to me and pain I had felt. And so through the process, what you do is you kind of like imagine yourself like taking the part of you that is so hurt. So, you know, if you're like the 15-year-old self when my dad died or whatever it is, and then there's a process of self-compassion in which you effectively sort of, it sounds a little strange to verbalize, but like you sort of talk to that wounded part of you in the same way you might, you know, go help a child who's fallen down and scraped their knee. Like the amount of compassion we can have for a child, especially even one that's like not even our own, if they fall down and you say like, I'm so sorry you're sad. I am so sorry you're in pain. Like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. We have this compassion that kind of bubbles up inside us for children when they hurt themselves. And yet when we're children and something hurts us, or even more blasphemous, when we're an adult and something hurts us, it's like, shut it down. And, you know, what this process did is it just kind of allowed me in the safety of my own home, which was key, over the phone. So it wasn't like I had this like person in a suit, you know, tapping her pen, glaring at me. You know, from the safety of my own home, I was like kind of allowed to work with myself and learn to have compassion and verbalize it and identify my feelings in a way that I had never felt like I had the freedom or ability to do. And this just blew open my notion of like the idea of healing, because I started, you know, what happened is I would have a session and then maybe I'd have a few really bad days where it almost felt just like, you know, kind of like if you walk on an injured leg, if you try and run on an injured leg and it hurts too much, right? Even though it's still healing, like it's like all the gunk just kind of came up, and then I would start to feel a release. And I just did this over and over again with this counselor for a year while I was traveling. And by the time I finished and I, you know, was about to go back to New York after this year, like I just had this deep understanding that this, you know, this depression that I thought was going to last for my entire life, like it was gone. And I don't say that lightly, like it was gone and it has stayed gone. I have not had a single depressive episode in 3 years since I've got off these drugs. Like I have had very bad days, but that does not turn into a bad life. And that's the difference.
And I think that's an important distinction to make there. You know, that one bad day is not going to completely sidetrack and derail the whole progress that you've made. You know, whereas it may have done that previously, perhaps.
Yeah.
So looks like we're actually coming up on time here. And I know we had talked about this offline a little bit, but you said you have a book that's coming out, and hopefully you can share a little bit about that. If you have a release date yet, or if it's still in progress, and we can leave that part out. But tell us a little bit about that book and
so
what that's all about.
I have spent the past 2 years effectively writing this story. It will be my second book. I've done this once before. So I'm very familiar with the process, and it's real slow process. So I actually think I finished like my third draft. I want to say today, more or less. It's going to get sent off to my editor, hopefully by the end of the week. There's no release date at the moment. I have made the choice to carefully tool the book before totally shopping it around. But I am seeking representation if there's anybody out there. However, the way I aim to get this book out and get it out big. So, I'm doing everything I can to make sure that it's the best story and the best message I can possibly tell. And yeah.
All right, great. And when it does come out, we'll definitely add links to the website to let people know where it is and share it on social media and all that other stuff to help you out with that as well. Before we go, do you have a place where people can kind of get in touch with you, either social media or website, things like that?
Yeah, so my Instagram is just @BrookeSeam, just my first and last name. My website is brookseam.com. Instagram is probably the best way to get a hold of me on social media. However, I've been very consciously stepping away a little bit in order to, Instagram likes to show you a lot of false reality. So prefer to just live in the real one.
Sure, absolutely. That's a better better place to be living is in the real world, I guess. But so just so people can kind of follow along with your journey, maybe find out a little bit more about you and your book and upcoming things that you might have going on. So I'll link to all of that in the show notes. So thank you very much for joining me and joining us and sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Drive On Podcast. If you want to check out more episodes or learn more about the show, you can visit our website, driveonpodcast.com, or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @DriveOnPodcast.